Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here to talk about and share with you 4 professional mixing techniques that are actually really simple and don't require a lot of money or fancy plugins that for some reason amateurs choose to skip over and outright ignore. Let's dive into it. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into the 4 techniques that amateurs and home studio owners tend to ignore when it comes to mixing. And it's a shame because these techniques make a massive difference and pro mixers use them all of the time. And stick around to the end because I think you're going to find the 4th technique to be pretty surprising. Mixing technique number 1 that amateurs tend to just outright skip over is the utilization of simple low shelf and high shelf filters. Now, a lot of us here on the internet tend to make mixing a giant science experiment, and we're often looking for problem frequencies. And we'll say, our guitars are too dark, our vocals are too muddy, our drums are too boomy, our drums are too weak. And we'll go around hunting for magical frequencies, and we do all of this overly complex stuff, parallel compression, MS processing, when in reality, all you really have to do is either darken up the source or brighten up the source in some cases, and I've come to find in most cases. So for example, I have a mix here that I just wrapped up. I'm going to play a little bit of the mix and I'm going to share with you how I'm using a low shelf filter to clear up my drum sound and a high shelf filter to add sparkle and sheen to the vocal tracks. Let's check it out. Okay, so right here is the EQ that I have on my drum bus. After mixing the track and listening to it the following day, I came to realize that the drums are just a little too subby. Too much information, too much power in the frequencies below 100 hertz. So instead of me going into the mix and overcomplicating what I already have that's working, I simply went in there and reduced all frequencies below 100 hertz by around 2.5 to 3 dB. Super simple. Again, this is a shelf filter or a shelf EQ. It's almost like turning the bass down on your home stereo or something like that. There's no reason to make things complicated. And also, I felt that her vocals sounded great, but I wanted to add a little bit of extra sparkle. No, I did not go in there and add an exciter to each of the individual vocal tracks or slap some fancy, analog emulation plugin on her vocal tracks. All I did was go in there with the stock EQ plugin, put it on the vocal submix, and boosted all frequencies above around 6.5K by 2 dB. I'm gonna bypass these filters and I will re-engage each filter and pay close attention to the low end of the mix and to the high end of her vocals. Check it out. So all of a sudden the mix is much more clear, the drums are less overpowering, and her vocals are much more angelic and sparkly sounding. And this leads me to technique number 2 that home studio owners tend to gloss over, and that is utilizing simple saturation within your DAW. As amazing as DAWs are, as amazing as modern day interfaces are and how clean they are, the problem is DAWs and modern day interfaces are way too clean and way too sterile. So we have to add color in the mix. Now let me give you a few examples here. So in my mix here, on each of the individual drum tracks, I'm using some simple console emulation. On my drum submix, I'm using yet another console emulator here and some tape compression. On my master bus, I'm using another tape compressor or tape saturator. On the vocals, I'm using a tape saturator. It doesn't matter what you use or what plugins you're using, even if you're using stock plugins. The idea is to add saturation in your mix to add color. It's not as important as EQ and compression, and of course, just recording great tracks at the source, but it will add that extra 10 to 15% in your mix that might be missing. Saturation glues things together, it adds excitement and color, and makes recording sound like professional records. All right, and this one is a big one. Amateurs, for some reason, are scared of using LCR panning. Here's the thing. You don't have to turn panning into rocket science. I don't know what it is. People will send me their mixes all the time and say, hey, Bobby, my mix sounds really, really narrow and cluttered. What mastering plugin should I use? What stereo widener should I use? And I'll listen to their mix and everything is sort of stepping on top of one another. And I'll ask them, are you hard panning your guitars? Are you hard panning your overheads? Are you panning your gang vocals out and your background vocals out? I'll often notice they have lead guitars right on top of the main vocal and not panned out to the side. I follow an LCR approach when mixing. So for example, if you look at my drums here, most of my drums are hard panned. And once in a blue moon, I'll pan certain things in. So for example, toms, my rack tom is 45% to the right and my floor tom is 70% to the left. Overheads are hard panned. Guitars are all hard panned. Vocals are up the center or hard panned. For me, most of my mix is hard panned and that's why it sounds wide. It makes absolutely no sense to pan your stuff in and then try to widen your mix with a stereo widener. Again, mixing does not have to be complicated. Just use LCR panning for most of your tracks. And as long as your recording is great and your arrangement is good and you're using solid mixing techniques, you will have a mix that is plenty wide, believe me. Okay, and this leads me into the final pro level mixing technique that home studio owners and amateurs always skip over, and it is a shame because it's a must utilize technique in my opinion. If you're not using this technique, you are selling yourself short, believe me. And I have news for you. It's 100% free within your DAW. And that technique is simple volume automation. Again, people will say to me, you know, my mix sounds cluttered, my guitars have nowhere to fit, my vocals and guitars are conflicting. Let me give you a simple example of how I use volume automation. So after the bridge here, we have a guitar solo. Let's take a listen. Okay, so while she is playing the solo, I've gone in there and turned the rhythm guitars down by exactly a half a dB. But here's the thing, a half a dB on your rhythm guitar submix makes a difference. And it creates a little bit more space for the lead guitar. So the lead guitars don't have to be as loud in the mix, and the guitars sound nice and uniform throughout the entire track, whether it's a solo or the rhythm guitars throughout the rest of the song. Again, I know people skip over automation because it seems boring and not as fun as messing with EQ plugins and compressor plugins, but again, you can't skip it. It really does go a long way. Another place where people skip automation, where they really shouldn't, is on vocal tracks. It doesn't matter how much you compress your vocals, the human voice is very dynamic. Sometimes a singer might be hitting a low note or a high note, and you want to bring all of those little inflections and all of that awesome human energy outward in the mix. So for example here, in the verse, I have a ton of volume automation to bring out all of the little details in her vocal performance. It's subtle, but check it out. So certain words I'm pumping up, other words I'm bringing down. If I were to delete that automation, her vocals wouldn't sound as interesting. Check it out. Certain words get lost. So what happens to a lot of home studio owners and mixers is they tend to either make things too loud or too quiet, when in reality, you shouldn't be doing either one. Use volume automation. It doesn't have to be complicated and it's free. The truth is, you don't even need any third-party plugins or fancy gear to achieve the results that you're really looking for with your music. You just have to have a solid understanding of the basics and the fundamentals of recording and mixing. So many of us get caught up in the same old traps, and I don't want this for you. I want you producing better results with the gear that you currently have. And because of this, I'm offering you direct access for absolutely free right now to my exclusive training for dead simple ways to massively improve your recordings and mixes. In this training, I share my #1 technique for prepping heavy guitar tracks that virtually mix themselves. I also share with you how to create instantaneous clarity within your mix using any old stock EQ plugin. You'll also learn how to take control over the levels in your mix so that instruments stop fighting with one another. And then finally, you'll learn how to craft a radio-ready vocal mix using only stock plugins. Now, word of warning, if you have the attention span of a squirrel, don't bother watching this training. The training is really in depth. It's almost an hour long, and it's only meant for people who are serious about improving their recordings and mixes. So many of us would rather just throw money at gear, hoping that that will solve the problem, when in reality, it won't. It's your skills and knowledge that will solve the issue. And before I forget to mention, if you've liked the song that you've heard in this tutorial, this is a band that I just wrapped up producing called Raising Arizona. They're a brand new band. If you're interested in hearing more, check out their social media account. I'll leave a link below in this video's description. So let me know, do you follow any of these 4 techniques when you're mixing your own music? Or are they things that you kind of skip over because they seem kind of boring? Don't be shy, be honest. I didn't use these techniques when I first started. It took me over a decade to realize just how powerful they were, because much like everyone else, I was more interested in buying high-end preamps, new plugins, and searching forums for the latest gear. Until next time, happy mixing.